Great. Very nice to meet you. I'm Juliet Parker. I'm the director of ALNAP. ALNAP is the learning network for the humanitarian sector. So our job really is to bring together a network of organizations from across the sector to harvest and synthesize and analyze the learning in ways that we can help put it back into the sector for improved humanitarian response for the future. Thank you so much to the Estonian Refugee Council for the invitation to join the conference here today, and to Eero and Maren for opening this event. Sorry, I'm a bit out of breath from having run down the steps. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to today's interesting discussions. I've been asked to give some opening thoughts on the macro trends currently shaping the humanitarian sector. And in doing so, I'll be referring to the State of the Humanitarian System report. This is ALNAP's flagship report and the only independent longitudinal assessment of performance in the humanitarian system. In September last year, we published the 5th edition of the report covering the years 2018 to 2021 inclusive. Since then, we've discussed findings for a year with over 50 audiences globally, which has been an eye-opening and valuable opportunity. And there are some consistent themes from both the research and those discussions that have come up, which I want to reflect on as you take the opportunity today to exchange on some of the issues that you're grappling with. I'll be discussing with you today how the system is trying to maintain its balance while dealing with a stretch in its remit, a shift in power, a funding ledge, and an increasingly tricky tightrope to walk on principled humanitarian action. So let's start with the remit stretch. There are 3 key features of the landscape for crises and humanitarian action which have come up repeatedly in our discussions across the sector over the past year. We know that the overall demand and price tag for humanitarian aid is rising. Our report tracked that rise, and since our report came out, that trend has only continued upwards, with over $50 billion requested through the UN appeal system alone this year. We know that more and more, the humanitarian caseload is made up of long-running, so-called protracted or perma-crises. These comprised 70% of all humanitarian funding needs in 2021. We also know that, as people spend more time in crisis, they increasingly seek support that addresses their longer-term aspirations and the root causes of crises, rather than continuing to receive repetitive, short-term relief. So in short, protracted crises are both driving up the demand on humanitarian resources, while at the same time, these are the crises where the relevance of what humanitarians can offer is being tested and pushed to its limits. A lot of this seems to point to the importance of strengthening links across humanitarian development and peace efforts, the so-called HDP nexus reform areas. But our research found that, despite the nexus now entering its 7th year as a key policy issue in the sector, and despite the huge momentum created by the DAC recommendation on the nexus in 2019, that overall progress on the nexus remains quite patchy. A key reason for this is that there are still widely varying interpretations of what the nexus actually means and what success looks like. People might complain about the lack of progress we've seen on localization, and we'll get to that in a minute, but at least the localization agenda has set clear targets, so we know what it's aiming to achieve. For some, the nexus is about strong coordination, and we saw good indications of this happening at country level, albeit largely driven still by humanitarian actors. If the nexus is about breaking down silos, then there are promising examples here. But overall funding mechanisms have largely remained siloed, and if you think the nexus should be about addressing root causes and ending the drivers of humanitarian need, potentially the interpretation most aligned with what people affected by crisis say they want, then the evidence is pretty strong that this isn't happening. And this presents a few difficult questions that we heard other donors and agencies grappling with. In particular, reflecting on humanitarian needs, how these are defined and who defines them, whether the caseload needs to be reduced by a refocusing on the most severe and life-saving needs, and what this means for the people trapped in protracted crises where development actors have retreated. We've also heard donors talk about the need to better coordinate to support nexus approaches, both within individual donors, but also across, and to include their engagement with multilateral development banks as part of this coordination. And over the course of the past year, as we presented our report, we heard about more small to medium donors joining the growing pool of examples of providing blended financing that can be used for a range of purposes without needing to fit into the classic developmental or humanitarian boxes, posing the question of how the wider sector can learn from these experiences and perhaps scale them. We heard similar questions about the system's ability to change when it comes to shifting power to communities through accountability to affected populations, AAP practices, and to local and national actors through localization commitments. There's a number of factors one can look at to assess progress on localization, but the two biggest ones have been funding and decision-making power. If we just take funding, the two most photographed slides across our events were probably these two. This one, which depicts the reverse trend in direct funding to local and national actors away from the 25% grand bargain target, with local actors receiving directly 1.2%. And we've updated this slide to reflect this year's GHA numbers, which were not in our report. And then in contrast to this, nearly half of all humanitarian funding, 47% over 2018 to 2021, went to only 3 UN agencies. And while localization and accountability to affected populations do have their distinct issues, it is perhaps sobering to note that local NGOs' experiences of the international humanitarian system echo the experiences reported by communities of the humanitarian support they receive, feelings of disempowerment and a despondency when it comes to the prospect of having any real say in influencing how decisions are made. While both localization and AAP are now very mature reform issues, it didn't stop them from feeling like very live, pressing priorities, as organizations are really trying to grapple with the lack of transformative shifts since the World Humanitarian Summit. Some questioned whether transformative change is possible or realistic, while others are doubling down on the big commitments their organizations made several years ago to really unpick the stubborn barriers. A big example of this is the recommitment of several grand bargain signatories just this past March to finding ways to bridge the gap of the 25% direct funding target. For donors in particular, there are questions on how they can work around their inability to fund local and national NGOs directly by incentivizing better partnership models in UN agencies and INGOs, as well as a tricky balance in finding workarounds for due diligence requirements that can create barriers to access for local actors, while at the same time navigating an increasingly critical and politically conservative domestic environment for aid. Now to talk about the funding ledge. The third most photographed slide in our presentations was this one, showing the concentration of humanitarian funding. 57% came from 5 donors in 2021, and nearly a third from the US alone. In other words, that the humanitarian system was balanced on the budgets of a handful of donors, and that although this concentration was nothing new, it appeared to be particularly precarious, as that year we saw significant aid reductions from a number of major donors. Nearly 7 years on from the World Humanitarian Summit calls to diversify the funding base, the system seemed to be worryingly stuck in this dependency. In the years since we launched the report, some of the fears around declining volumes were assuaged. We saw an uptick in funding from nearly all major donors, but this appeared to be largely driven by the Ukraine response, and while volumes might have increased, the concentration of donors actually thickened. By 2022, the 3 largest donors accounted for 64%, and the US alone for 39%. And while the established Western donors may have increased their aid, others proved more volatile. For example, funding from the Saudis nearly halved. As we expected, as we talked to donors and aid agencies around the world about the report findings, most discussions eventually or quickly came back to funding. And 3 big questions emerged from all the funding discussions. Can the funding base really be diversified? In previous reports, we heard a lot of hopes pinned on emerging donors, innovative finance initiatives, and multilateral development banks. This time, these were a little more muted. In our seminar with the World Bank staff, we heard on the one hand of great potential for supporting crisis prevention, response and recovery, but at the same time, a clear reality check that this should not be seen as a funding source for the core work of the humanitarian system. Which links to the second point, that there is significant funding that flows outside the formal humanitarian system. Direct giving, private funds, development funds, all critical to the response, but which the system still little understands or takes into account. In the State of the Humanitarian System report, we tried to acknowledge and reflect these flows, but struggled to quantify or meaningfully map them. Our working definition of the system is linked to receiving international humanitarian funding, but how do we all rethink our relationship with the ecosystem outside the system? And thirdly, we heard many calls for better donor coordination, whether to allow better coverage of forgotten crises, reduce the bureaucratic burdens for grantees, or leverage collective power for system change. But if this is hard enough among a concentrated donor base, what would it mean for a diversified one? Especially in a world where the geopolitical fault lines have become starker than ever before, and pretensions of apolitical aid are laid bare. This brings us to the fourth area of dilemma and debate that has dominated our discussions over the past year. The principles tightrope that humanitarians are walking in a changing geopolitical landscape and in changing contexts of constrained humanitarian space. Our research in the State of the Humanitarian System report revealed many signs of this constrained space. A striking indicator was the rise in attacks on aid workers since the previous edition, a rise of over 2/3 in the space of 6 years. Evidence from Syria to Myanmar and our case studies in Ethiopia and Bangladesh also highlighted the dilemmas and compromises humanitarians were facing as they sought to somehow deliver on their principles of humanity while maintaining a semblance of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. As one of our interviewees put it, we're in an absolute crisis of a fight for core norms. In the years since we published the State of the Humanitarian System report, the operating space hasn't got any easier. The numbers of attacks on aid workers has only marginally declined, and the vast majority of victims were local and national staff. For the first time, local and national NGOs were worse affected than INGOs. Linking back to our analysis of localisation, it appears that while funding isn't being significantly transferred, risks certainly are. Further analysis by a Norwegian think tank has also shown that in the 15 years since the first edition of the SOS, we have seen and are continuing to see a significantly transformed global political order, playing out in both the space for domestic civil society resistance and reaction and Western-led humanitarian response. Unlike the heyday of liberal democratization in the 90s, we are now witnessing a democratic decline and erosion of civil society space. So what does this mean for principled humanitarian action? Discussion of our State of the Humanitarian System findings centered on 3 questions. First, whether the system could still lay claim to its principles, and whether we could do with more honest and open assessment about where, faced with real-world dilemmas, international donors and agencies were making trade-offs between staying to deliver and standing firm on principled red lines. In our review of the evidence, we found a striking lack of evaluations of the processes and outcomes of these decisions. Secondly, how could the humanitarian staff making these daily difficult decisions on the front line of humanitarian response be better enabled to do so with the support of their organizations? The evidence sources we gathered for the State of the Humanitarian System report suggested that in-country staff often lacked the guidance, skills, and senior backing to walk the tightrope and make what are inevitable trade-offs between access and principles. And third, which brings us back to the previous point, given that the humanitarian system relies on local and national staff and organizations to access the places where internationals cannot reach, how can it do so with due attention to ethics and duty of care? As we discussed these 4 challenges to the humanitarian system, the remit stretch, the power shift, the funding ledge, and the principles tightrope, again and again we heard a determined call for change at this potential inflection point for the humanitarian system, for a reaffirmation and reframing of what the humanitarian expression of global solidarity with crisis-affected people should look like now. And as it does so, it may be worth summarizing what we heard from others. A call for world leaders to be assertive about the imperative to respond to humanitarian suffering, to be ambitious about the support crisis-affected people should expect to shape, and to be humble about the role of international actors to lead and deliver this alongside frontline responders. But before I sign off, a few learning points relating to your topics of discussion today in case of use. I've already talked about localization, but the interesting distinction that's gaining strength at the moment is the difference between localization, where the sector is trying to localize itself, as distinct from locally led action, where the sector steps outside itself to provide direct support to local groups without them having to be part of our system. For example, mutual aid and the survivor and community-led response approaches, thereby sidestepping many of the institutional blockages that are inhibiting the progress of localization. On digitalization, with its significant and exciting potential, learning suggests that humanitarians remain susceptible to being attracted to what is shiny rather than what is needed, and that they can tend to take individual organizational approaches in line with our competitive model, rather than investing collectively in ways that may deliver greater outcomes for the sector. And on cash, this has been the great learning example for the humanitarian sector of the last 10 years, successfully growing in volume and as a proportion of humanitarian assistance, whilst also demonstrating increasing evidence of positive outcomes across a range of sectors. What potential, then, for cash interventions with their positive learning curve to become increasingly instrumental in shifting the dial on the learning sticking points of AAP, localization, and the nexus, where the sector is struggling to make the progress it wants. And with that, I wish you the very best for an interesting day of discussions ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. And I know that you're also ready to receive questions, if there happen to be any. You can just raise your hand.
Hi, my name is Faisal. I work alongside some of the organizations here. I think Mondo is definitely in-house. I'm rather new to the sphere, and my question is specifically about hidden fees and the difficulty with not fees, funding, and with tracking it in your report. What are these sort of hidden fundings in the context of, for a newbie like me? What does that mean?
Maybe we could take the second question as well.
Was there a second question from somewhere here, or did I imagine?
Hi, my name is Luisa. I'm an independent, been in the humanitarian sector for almost 20 years now. And so my question, having followed the ALNAP process in the State of the World's humanitarian system for many years, did you find anything positive out of the last 5 years? Do you have an example where it's working, or there's something really kind of encouraging? I think that would be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, maybe I can start with the good news question first. Yes, there is a lot of positive indications. The humanitarian system is delivering more aid more successfully to more people across the world than ever before. And what the evidence shows is that the humanitarian sector is getting incrementally better at doing what it was set up to do, which is delivering assistance in terms of scale and speed. The challenge and frustration comes from the humanitarian system now wanting to do things that it wasn't set up to do. So it was set up for scale and speed, but now what we want to do is scale and speed and highly customized responses that are tailored to much more contextual preferences. And that's where this tussle comes in, and that's where you see the issues that the sector is getting frustrated with itself about. But there is slow incremental improvement in performance. We are delivering on a bigger scale than ever before. What the humanitarian system is really good at is response programming, And also there's really good indications of improved outcomes on a whole range of technical sectors. Nutrition, health, cash, of course, water interventions, there's more evidence of outcomes and better evidence, which all puts us in a better situation to be able to talk about humanitarian performance. In terms of hidden funding, I'm not sure exactly what forms of hidden funding you're talking about. There's two areas, really. One is our ability to track, understand, and comment on financial flows within our system. So this has challenges, which my colleagues would be delighted to talk at length about, because we face it every 3 or 4 years when we produce the report, is how to actually get an accurate picture of financial flows. One is that the overall system, the sector's systems are not great at tracking it. The other is that there isn't total transparency. So if we're talking about, issues of passing on of overheads or any of those sorts of things, it's quite difficult to get an accurate picture because the sector is not incentivized to be particularly transparent. But there's also this issue of financial flows outside of the system, and this is what I referred to in the presentation. We know that official humanitarian assistance is a tiny proportion of overall humanitarian assistance globally, but it's very difficult to map the system outside the system or to get an accurate picture of informal financial flows. So there's a whole area that we just don't really know about, and yet one of the obvious shifts that the humanitarian sector is moving towards is having to be better at coordinating, communicating with, understanding and complementing the system outside the system. And we can only start to do that if we understand who they are, how they work, and what and the financial flows as well as other things.
Any more questions?
Hello, I'm Mari from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and thank you for a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask if you're also researching the new and emerging donors, and what are the trends there?
Is there another question as well, maybe? Over there.
Hi, thanks. I'm Luke from the IFRC. So Juliet, a question about networks and how you analyze networks. So what do you talked about a system. How could you describe what that system is? And then you talked about an ecosystem. What is that? And so what techniques or what kind of approaches do you use to try to understand what it is that we're describing when we say the humanitarian system? Okay,
so this is again, if I'll start with the second question first, maybe. Okay, so this is a really complicated question, and I would definitely recommend reading the State of the Humanitarian System report, because actually within that, one of the useful things is about it is that we have to define the sector and what we mean by the formal humanitarian sector, and it has increasingly fuzzy edges. There's also, in one of our other presentations, there's a map where we map, and it's an extremely complex map. The reality, yes, so I can't actually particularly answer it, but very happy to take it offline and give you a much more detailed answer. But it's really complex and constantly challenged, rightly challenged. And each time we go into the next process, which we're just starting now, of delivering the next State of the Humanitarian System report, we are again challenged. It's like on where the edges of the formal system sit. And one of the findings is that we need to, as I said, we need to be much more cognizant of the external ecosystem and how we relate to it, how sincere we are about relating to it, and what we need to understand about our language approaches and connections. And emerging donors. We do talk, well, they're an interesting prospect for a variety of reasons. And we're seeing different trends in emerging donors, which again, I can pull out more detail if you want. From a learning perspective, I think emerging donors are really interesting because they bring a different learning agenda. And here I'm not only talking about, for example, smaller governmental donors, but also the growth in foundations. And foundations sit somewhat outside our sector and bring quite different attitudes and expectations about performance, approach, learning approaches, and what it is that we're looking for. One of the challenges with the formal system in its kind of state of evolution is we seem to have got a bit stuck we wanted to professionalize over the last 20 or 25 years, and we've almost professionalized in some ways to the point where we can't now do what it is that we want to be able to do, and we seem to have lost some of that flexibility. And there where you have smaller or emerging donors, whether governmental or non-governmental, they bring in a different focus and a different aspect and don't seem to be as constrained by the limitations we've put on ourselves by the more established traditional donors. And from a learning perspective, as a learning network, we're really interested in what potential that brings in for bringing in new perspectives.
Good morning. Hi, my name is Riina from the Estonian Refugee Council. Thanks for the report. From the learning perspective, does ALNAP actually study some long-term protracted crisis like Afghanistan, Myanmar, Somalia, and sort of bring lessons from those cases also to the general reports? And then does it actually make suggestions for the policymakers to change the course of action?
Sure. I think there's another question over there as well, if you want to take two.
Hi, I'm Christy Akpa from Mondo. I'm curious about the transfer of risk that you were discussing. I'd really appreciate it if you could explain that a little bit. What kind of risks have been transferred? Are there any safeguards being put in place, to protect the local actors, and just a little bit more clarity on that point, because it seems to me kind of like it's just the fact that it's been transferred over, but why and what's being done about it would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Great. Maybe I'll talk about the learning cycles approach. So within this report, actually we have longitudinal indicators for the system that we've tracked now over 15 years. But in terms of country-specific issues, in each report we pull out particular case studies of countries where we can take a deeper dive. But this is a very macro-level report where we sort of cover everything, but it's a struggle to then cover anything in very much depth. Where we do pick up learning kind of over extended periods of time, what we found is that humanitarians have very short memories. Each response, there's a kind of new enthusiasm for everyone bringing their new ideas, when actually you can see that, well, as I mentioned earlier, that real learning and change in the humanitarian sector is slow and incremental. And one of our jobs at ALNAP is to make sure that the learning from the past is feeding back into the responses, current and future responses to enable better learning. For example, when with the Ukraine response, we went back to the Kosovo response, which had been 20 years before, to go back to some of the evaluations there and pull out actually what was the relevant learning from there that could be usefully applied in Ukraine. And what we found was that in a 20-year period, some things had changed dramatically. The adoption of mobile phone technologies was dramatically, significantly different. But on other aspects of the response, it was exactly the same. Huge levels of funding going in, a chase for adopting national partners, all sorts of very pragmatic programming aspects. The challenges were still exactly the same. So that's part of our role. In terms of, we don't personally track learning on individual contexts because there are other mechanisms to do that. But what we do try to do is to harvest that learning at a global level in order to feed it back into these reports. So I hope that sort of answers. In terms of the transfer of risk, that's a really complicated question, but actually quite well documented. So there's quite a lot of research done on it. And essentially, it's about the way that our business model is set up. So as you saw, we want a more diversified, inclusive humanitarian system. But the reality is that the resources are becoming more concentrated, which means that you have more funding going kind of through many intermediaries to get to the point of implementation. but that the funding does not, becomes more projectized the further down that chain you go, which means that there is less flexible financing for financing things like security training or other kind of core costs that would enable national organizations to better invest in and protect their staff. There's there is a struggle with incentive structures within the system to be able to deal with that, because no intermediary wants to take on more risk. But there's a natural kind of incentive to pass it down the chain. And the reality is that you see national organizations taking on much more of the risk without taking on the support structures and financing to be able to actually manage it in the way that they would consider appropriate. So that only half answers your question, but I'd be very happy to pick it up afterwards.
Thank you very much for all the questions and answers. We're a bit tight on time, so I'm sure you are ready to answer privately if you just approach Juliet when you see her chilling here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.